Got a toothbrush in my pocket.
Why?
Gotta be fresh. Gotta be fresh.
Hello everybody, welcome to What Culture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello, Scott.
Josh, my friend, on today's news, we're just going to talk about Final Fantasy 16. The game's finally out. It's one of the most anticipated RPGs of all time, and I've been playing it for a good few hours. However, I thought the angle of this video would be best served diving into the conversation around what a new mainline installment of Final Fantasy means, because I do think there's still quite a lot of, not necessarily misinformation, but a lack of information out there. Some people still think that it's a big 16-part saga, that not each individual game is its own thing. Someone like Josh has a lot of questions as to how it's going to play and everything, because it's your first Final Fantasy, and I'm, as a massive Final Fantasy veteran nerd thing, I'm just glad to field as much of that as possible.
Like you said, Scott, I've got so many questions because I'm looking forward to Final Fantasy 16 so much. The responses to it, the reviews, the responses from the demo have all been pretty high on it. And like you said, the only other Final Fantasy game I have played through to completion is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which introduced me to this entire franchise and got me interested in this game to begin with. But I have a lot of questions because everyone is telling me that this is like the most different Final Fantasy game ever made up until this point. And I kind of want to know what that means, because those differences to an outsider like me, a big dumb Call of Duty lover, as people have been referring to us as on the internet.
Yeah, Naoki Yoshida wants you to play Final Fantasy. He literally said, let's make a Final Fantasy for the Call of Duty fan. He's managed to get you
Which is me, it's made me interested, but I'm also intrigued as to why this game is so different and why that may be not everyone's cup of tea, especially hardcore Final Fantasy fans.
Yeah, so the crux of this is one of the main things to talk about is why people are divided on Final Fantasy 16. I say people because I think it is quite a small portion of the fan base who are still divided on it, even after playing the demo. However, I do see where they're coming from in terms of this not being a turn-based Final Fantasy. This is the most action direction the Final Fantasy has taken in ever. Like, I mean, if you go back, obviously you got Final Fantasy VII Remake, but that still had a turn-based mentality in terms of freezing the combat, picking your spells, whatever. Final Fantasy 15 kind of had that. It was like an attempt at live-action combat, but you were still sort of planning different moves out and whatever. This is a full-on Devil May Cry, Platinum Games style Final Fantasy, which is very exciting in itself. Going into this, before I played the demo, I was a little bit skeptical as well, because one of the things I want from Final Fantasy is the turn-based stuff. It's the strategic approach to combat, it's building various classes, it's building a party that can all bounce off each other, etc. And in this game, you only play as Clive, you only play as one dude, for the most part anyway. There's a few little story scenes in there where other things happen, but for the most part, it's Clive. And that was something that made people bounce off. But because they've got DMC5, Devil May Cry 5's combat designer in here, it is just a platinum action game for like 80 hours, which, now that you actually get hands-on with it, works very well.
The move towards action as an outsider to this franchise has been music to my ears. That is something that appeals to me more than the turn-based combat did previously. However, what I want to ask, and I'm going to be referring to Final Fantasy VII Remake a lot in this video because it's my main reference point, but that was also at the time, kind of talked about as the most action heavy, or at least the most real-time action heavy Final Fantasy that there was.
Totally.
So in comparison to that, as my reference point, like, how does the feel of this game, how is it different, like, in terms of the actual core action and core combat? Is it more streamlined? Is it heftier? Is it more responsive? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, so it is massively immediate. Like, you do have an approach to combat that is like a Devil May Cry, where you have, a dedicated, like, square. If I'm talking about PlayStation, square is your melee button, triangle is your range button. You have like a dash that can close distance. You also have a parry. If you attack well enough, if something's have an incoming attack, you can punch through that and attack back, like Metal Gear Rising. But you also have, like I said, a dodge.
Like Metal Gear Rising.
Like Metal Gear Rising
to my ears.
Not enough people mention Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, but that game also had a thing where if you attack at the right time, you can punch through the enemy's attack to do a parry instead. 16 has that too. You also have a button that lets you close distance, like a dedicated zoom to enemy button, which you can also use as an evasive move too. But it is very immediate. Like, it is one of those things where, to me, so far, one of the only weaknesses is that the camera isn't keeping up with me as well as I want it to. But I think that's maybe just because I'm ping-ponging between enemies, I'm firing off spells, I'm doing as much as the game's letting me.
You've already mentioned that there's no character switching like there have been in other Final Fantasy games, including Final Fantasy VII, but is there still that element of tactical awareness to the combat that was in 7, where you were popping off different spells as you go and waiting for meters to kind of cool down before you could do those attacks?
I honestly think, I still think, and I'm going to play obviously the rest of 16, I'll see how the rest of it lands. I still think Final Fantasy VII Remake and assumedly Rebirth's combat system is the best Final Fantasy combat system they could have. For me, that was a perfect, walking the line perfectly between strategic, turn-based, pausing combat, in the remake's case, it slows everything down. That side of it, and then going back to real time, diving in for the combos, doing different moves on the fly, holding L1, doing some shortcuts to do things faster. I love that they let you walk that line between the two, and if you want to stick in the super slow motion mode and plan everything out a lot more, you could, or you could just go in blades blazing and take everything out. In 16, unless you pause the game, as far as I've seen so far, there's not that same pause, slow things down, take a minute kind of thing. It's more about just sort of diving in and playing it like a Devil May Cry or a Platinum game. In terms of your abilities, though, I mentioned some button combos and stuff before. Spell-wise, you're getting more moves by cycling through the various summons/icons that you have equipped. So it's one of those things where, like, on the fly, you can change your triangle ranged move from, if you had a Freed equipped, you'd be doing fire, you can switch that to Shiva, to Titan, whatever, and do ground attacks, do ice attacks. That also changes the way that some of your other moves work as well, and your ultimate as well. So, like, that on the fly is cool, but you're still only fundamentally playing as one dude, and you're in the moment, flying between enemies, taking stuff on, and at a way faster pace than you were in any of the other Final Fantasies.
Tell me, if you can, because I know you're still very early doors with the game, like, what's the mission structure like? Because in Final Fantasy VII, I liked it, especially with the main missions. I thought they were well paced. I thought the set pieces were incredible. But when it came to the side missions, I kind of there are hours of Final Fantasy VII Remake I wish I hadn't done, because the missions themselves were just kind of a little repetitive and they didn't have much to them, and I felt like the rewards I was getting from them weren't all that great.
No,
I still love that game, but it had that element to it where it felt like there was a lot of filler, for lack of a better term.
No, that's true. I think for 7 Remake, it was very obvious, especially to those who played the original, just how much they were stretching out an hour of a game into like 40 or whatever, or 5 hours of a game into like 40 or more than that. In this case, obviously at the beginning, it's massively story focused. There's already been a few complaints online about how many cutscenes are in there. That's what I want from a Final Fantasy. To be honest, I want a lot of story and world building and lore and everything. And Yoshi P, Naoki Yoshida, the producer here, who's the guy that didn't single-handedly, but is responsible for resurrecting Final Fantasy XIV, made the entire team here watch all of Game of Thrones. There's a lot of Game of Thrones framing here in terms of the houses and warring factions and everything like that. So there's a lot of setting up stuff. Things do open up. One of the major criticisms that I'm seeing doing the rounds online as the world opens up more is that some of that Final Fantasy XIV stuff is in here in terms of MMO-style fetch quests and lots of go here, do this, come back.
Right.
One of the first things you do is just a basic go here, take out some enemies type thing before you get back to the main quest. But yeah, a bit of a mix. Where I am, it's still all cutscene heavy. It's still all, if you play the demo, you know how that thing ends. There's a big old thing that needs to be resolved there.
Yeah.
So it's very story heavy for the first few hours.
This is going to sound dumb, right? Because like I said, I've only played, 1.2 Final Fantasy games, because I played Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I also played like 5 hours of Crisis Core. It wasn't
yeah, you did.
But like, people talk about what Final Fantasy is, and I don't have the reference for that. But to me, I've always known that the games were separate, and it wasn't like one big continuity or one big storyline or anything like that. But the differences in the world and the differences in the character made me view it as this really cool, malleable franchise. But that doesn't seem to have translated to the combat or like kind of mechanical tropes that have been in the series.
Like over the decades.
Yeah, so like what makes this like such a departure? Is it just that kind of combat that we were mentioning? Or is it the story? Is it the mission structure? Like, is this, because in my head, from a pure setting perspective, from a pure character and visual perspective, it just looks kind of par for the course, like another reinvention of the series. But obviously, Final Fantasy fans all over the internet have been telling me that's not the case. And I know, dumb question, but I feel like there's a lot of other people in my boat out there looking at this, being like, well, what makes this special? What is it about this game?
That's the most beautiful part of all of this, is that, like, we can talk about the history of Final Fantasy and how it's sort of every individual game for the first, let's say, 10 installments was turn-based, but had major deviations within that framework. Like in Final Fantasy VIII, you had the drawing system where you were drawing materia, and the different like class systems that were in Final Fantasy IV and VI. There's loads of different deviations, but they were all within a turn-based framework.
Right.
And I feel like that was the thing that within the Final Fantasy community, it was always like, well, turn-based is Final Fantasy. What are you going to do with a turn-based system? And when that started being shaken up, either in FF11 when it became the first online one, 12 was the first major one where it was like, it's kind of turn-based, you're dialing moves in, but it's more like Kingdom Hearts where you have control of your character to run around and sort of play the angles game a little bit more in terms of like which enemies are going to aggro on your characters. And then 13 was like a return to turn-based, but it was all very automated. It was almost like an MMO thing. I hate 13, so I can't speak to that game that much. I never finished it. And then 14 was the MMO one again. 15 went a bit more live action. But to me, it wasn't until 7 Remake where it was like, okay, this is an action-style game. And like, that's why I always think that one's the perfect hybrid, because you could still choose to pause as much as you want to. This is the one where they are full-on Devil May Cry Platinum game. You are playing it like an action game. If you don't like action games, it's kind of not really for you, at least so far. They're so much committing to that wider AAA mainstream. Let's get everybody involved. Give you the button allocations are do some combos, do some moves.
Yeah.
They want you to feel immediately involved in this in a way that the other ones never did.
Interesting, man. Can I talk to you a little bit about the story? Because
all day long.
I don't want to know any spoilers. I don't want to know anything about this, really. You can tell me the basic framing, but I've been purposely keeping away.
Yeah, I don't want people to know spoilers
from all of the trailers or anything like that. So I only know the basics of what I'm getting into. I know the main guy is called Clive, which is incredible, and I know there are Geordies in there somewhere. And I know it's kind of like inspired by Game of Thrones.
There's a dude called Rodney in there as well.
Rodney!
Yes!
I can't wait to meet Rodney. And the Chris Finch from The Office is in there. He was also in Diablo. Love that guy's voice. Love that guy in The Witch. Amazing. Anyway,
He's doing very
not
well.
the point. The point is, as an outsider, the thing that's always appealed to me about the Final Fantasy games and what got me into 7 was the appeal of the story, was the presentation and how graphically impressive everything is, and like the lush direction of the cutscenes, the vibe, the world, the atmosphere, all of that stuff that I couldn't quite penetrate because I couldn't get over my hang-ups with the turn-based combat or whatever it was. With this, from the trailers that I've seen, like that would have sold me alone because it looks epic, it looks grand, the character models look incredible. I've heard a lot of good things about Clive as a character. In terms of similarities between other Final Fantasy stories, does it have that Final Fantasy DNA, whatever that is, in here, or is that another complete reinvention?
No, I would argue it does. I mean, like, obviously, without getting into specifics whatsoever, the fact that you have a major focus on the icons and or the summons or whatever you want to call them, they have different names in different Final Fantasies. That to me harkens back all the way to like Final Fantasy VI or even before then. Like there was always that thing of what are the summons, what are these like insanely overpowered forces, what do they really represent, etc. To me, that's been one of the most through-line things in nearly all the Final Fantasies, especially the most beloved ones like 6, 7, 10 as well, 9. All that stuff has always been in there, so I think that stuff harkens back. That's the thing. I mean, it's an interesting thing to posit. Like, what is a Final Fantasy? What makes something feel like a Final Fantasy? There are specific things you can point to, like the chocobos. You can ride chocobos in this.
I know what that is.
Various other chocobos in various other Final Fantasies. There's a character called Sid in every single Final Fantasy game. There's a dude called Sid here. I think that's actually who Finchie's playing.
Okay.
So that's that dude. But yeah, it's like those little through-line things, those little nods are in here. There's a whole thing doing the rounds in the press, in the marketing around 16, from Yoshi P and the rest of the team, saying the Final Fantasy is fundamentally malleable, and they could do all these other different things with it, and that's what they want to experiment with. I mean, we are 16 main installments in at this point, and with that comes a dedicated diehard community who know what they're getting with a Final Fantasy, but also from a creative standpoint, they might as well try new stuff because those old installments aren't going anywhere. They're as beloved as ever, and still as recommendable as ever. So for me, it does feel like a Final Fantasy, but I totally get why people are getting hung up on the combat because it is just so immediately different.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and again, maybe another stupid thing to say. Are there stupid questions?
There's no stupid questions.
I don't know if there is, but as an outsider, and I keep clarifying this, it seemed like Final Fantasy 13 wasn't that well received. Obviously, 14 was an MMO, but that wasn't well received at first, though it is beloved now. Then even Final Fantasy 15 at launch wasn't well received, though with all the DLC. Apparently, that's a good game now. Was something like this not needed? Because there's a lot of time between those installments, and could they have kept going on that trajectory, or was it kind of... I don't know.
Well, there was a weird thing with that because they greenlit a whole bunch of different games all at once, and then it was like what became Final Fantasy 15 started as, I think, Final Fantasy 13, and that game was all siphoned off. It was like what happened with the next Resident Evil, and then that became Onimusha, became Devil May Cry, and then eventually became Resident Evil. So it was like waiting for all those like things to land before they could fundamentally move on, and that's what 16 is. It feels like a way bigger, cleaner break from a lot of the baggage that that whole period had. I mean, there was a huge break in time between Final Fantasy 10 and even Final Fantasy 12 when it got back to being a single player game again. We're talking over like 10 years or whatever. So it's they've always kind of done this. They've always kind of took a step back and gone, what is Final Fantasy? What are we going for? And then because Yoshi P / Naoki Yoshida did so well with 14 and the online space, he was kind of just given the keys to the kingdom, literally Valisthea, the kingdom. Just do it. Just do what you think's good.
Cool.
Because we as a wider studio, we're Square Enix, we get everything wrong every few months anyway. Just do it. Just make it work. We're making The Quiet Man. We have no idea. We're making Various Daylights. We have no idea.
And that's why they didn't send us a review copy.
So it's like stuff like that where, yeah, they're sort of just, in a way, Final Fantasy, I liken them to Metallica, which is the weirdest thing.
Okay.
But Metallica, overall, they made such a point of reinventing themselves over the years and trying different things, and Metallica being this wider, malleable approach to music. And I like that idea, so I think it's always case by case. But you're right, they needed something that was fundamentally, this game's great. And to also the last point here is that the pre-orders were soft until people got hands on the demo.
Yeah.
And then it was like that thing where the Final Fantasy brand maybe was a little bit shaky outside of its core community, and then people actually just played it and went, no, this is great.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna pre-order, I'm gonna buy it.
Listen, man, like I want to kind of clarify, although I'm coming into 16 appreciative of the changes and them making it more accessible and the action focus, I don't want this necessarily to be the only Final Fantasy that I like.
Right.
I want this, like 7 Remake was in a way, to be like my entry point to the whole franchise. I want to be able to jump into this, appreciate the elements, and then appreciate them so much that I find myself saying, you know what, even though the previous gameplay style isn't my thing on paper, this has given me enough to latch onto that, yeah, I'm going to give those other games a go. I'm going to try to integrate myself into this franchise in a way that I never had before. That's what I wanted. I know that's a lot to ask, to not only love a game, but to have it make me adore an entire franchise. But I can only speak from a preview standpoint, from what everyone said about it and from my own personal excitement for the game. I hope it nails that.
Well, I think it's a little bit like the newest Zeldas, where they're so massively different from the dungeon-based, more linear structure of the older ones, but it makes you interested in what was there before, maybe because of certain iconic elements or identifiable elements or whatever. I think with Final Fantasy, I think it's completely valid to think that, because it is Final Fantasy 16. It's not colon type 0 like they did in the early 2010s. It is a specific numbered installment. That's the thing. The through-line appeal here for Final Fantasy as a franchise per installment is always going on a giant grand adventure with the best music you've ever effing heard in your life, and just really great grandiose themes like heroes and villains and magic and everything else. It definitely is that. That's the thing that like grounds it as feeling like a Final Fantasy. It's mainly the combat. That's obviously the thing that people are getting hung up on across the Final Fantasy community. But I think in terms of, should I play the other ones? Yeah, if you like this feel, this overall core feel of this majestic, beautiful experience, that's what the franchise has always been. And there are 15 other stories for you to get stuck into.
Am I going to get a bunch of like Final Fantasy 16 3-2 games with like Clive in? Because I don't even know what Clive is like, but I want more games with people called Clive in them.
I love Clive. I think he might be my favorite character in I don't even know how long, back till Tidus. I don't know, it's a long time.
Don't know who that is.
From Final Fantasy 10. Slash Tidus, but I call him Tidus. No, I think that happened with 13, where they were just sort of like I said, they had so much development hell, monstrous nightmare stuff with that game, where it ended up becoming this weird trilogy of like Lightning Returns and Final Fantasy 13 2 and whatever. And they tried that with Final Fantasy 10 2. I don't know, I guess we'll see what happens going forward. Naoki Yoshida has worked on Final Fantasy 14 since the resurrection of it was like 8 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And he's managed to maintain that, going from strength to strength. The Planeswalker stuff is doing really well. Planeswalker, I think, might be the name of something in Magic the Gathering. There's a thing in Final Fantasy 14 that he put out that people really liked, and the word plane was in it.
I'm going to trust you on that.
I'm going to trust me as well. I don't play Final Fantasy 14, but let us know what you think down in the comments below. Final Fantasy 16. We'll put a little video here that's something to do with RPGs. I don't know. I'll figure it out later. But for now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
And we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Looking forward to it.
Acons, mate. They're called Acons.